I started my career as an editor and I found it very difficult to design things because I had no design background. And if that sounds like you, I'm gonna help you out right now. And make sure you are subscribed to this channel because this is just one tip in a 3-video series we're gonna be releasing. And we're gonna start with what I think is one of the most common issues non-designers face when they're trying to design stuff. So here's a pretty simple example in After Effects. We have a background, we have some type, we have the ISS, and we have some design elements that are just kind of there to add flavor to it. This is a pretty typical setup for any kind of full screen graphic that you might be asked to throw together by a client while you're editing something. And looking at it, it's clear that something just isn't quite working. It's like my eye doesn't know where to go or something. There's actually a decent composition going on here. There's some lines kind of drawing your eye into the type, which is clearly the thing you're supposed to read. But something about it just kind of sucks. And when you don't have a design background, a lot of times you don't have the vocabulary to explain what it is that you don't like. Well, I'm going to tell you. The primary issue with this design is something called value structure. Now, what is value structure? This is just a simple After Effects comp I set up to demonstrate. So what you have here is a vertical bar that starts with this green-yellow color set to 0% brightness at the bottom. And as we get closer to the top, it approaches 100%. And when I'm saying 100%, I'm saying 100% of the brightness value of that color. And as I move it around, you'll see that, here's about 50% brightness, here's about 75% brightness, 25, and back down to 0. Every color that you can pick on a computer has a brightness value associated with it. And it's really useful to know what that is for reasons that will become clearer. So anytime you're designing, you are choosing brightness values for your colors that are either intentionally or unintentionally drawing your viewer's eye to it. So let's move this background layer up to, I don't know, somewhere in the 20s, and I'm gonna duplicate it, and I'm gonna move the duplicate up somewhere, and let's rename this. Let's call this important thing. Now, I know there isn't actually a design on screen, but just imagine that you have a brightness value for the important thing of 63%, and the background's brightness value is 27%. The distance between these two values dictates the amount of contrast that you will have in that part of the design. And here's the thing, our eyes are drawn to contrast. And so when you look at a design like this, where is the area of highest contrast? Well, it's actually right here, kind of in the corner of the design. It's not right here where the type is. On top of that, you've got areas of contrast kind of over here and here and here that are really unimportant. This is just sort of like extra spice to add a little bit more interest to the design, but they're not important at all. And this becomes even more clear if we turn on this black and white adjustment layer that I've added. It's just an adjustment layer with the black and white effect. And when I turn it on, it becomes crystal clear what's going on here. This is actually a trick I use all the time. I'll use a black and white adjustment layer or a hue and saturation with all of the saturation pulled out, because sometimes when there's actual hue and color on screen, it can kind of fool you and you can see more contrast than is actually there. And color theory gets a little bit more complicated than I'm making it out to be right now, but if you can nail the concept of brightness value and you can get the structure of those values correct, value structure, your designs will instantly be improved. So here's actually like a mathematical way to check this. You can see up here, I've got my info panel, and by default, if I hover over any pixel, it will show me the red, green, and blue value of that pixel. Now, because I have this black and white adjustment layer turned on, the red and blue and green pixels all have the exact same value because all we're seeing is the brightness. So I can use the R, G, or B value as sort of a proxy for brightness, but there's actually a better way to look at this. If you click on this little hamburger icon here on the info panel, you can change the color display to HSB. HSB stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. And B, that third one, that's really the thing we're concerned with here. Brightness is just another term for value. And so now if I hover over these background pixels, you can see that the brightness is about 31%. So why don't we actually set up the value structure to kind of mimic what's going on in that design? I'd also like to mention that this value graph comp and the entire After Effects project that I'm using to demonstrate this is available for free at schoolofmotion.com. You can get the link in the description. And if you want to follow along and actually try this out, go download that project file and follow along with me. You'll find that you'll learn things and you'll remember them a lot better if you do. So do. Whenever there's type on screen, you almost always want the viewer to look at that. It's almost always the most important thing. And that type currently has a brightness of 28%. So I'm going to duplicate this background layer and we're just going to rename this type. and we're going to lower that to 28%. And what else do we have? Well, we have the space station, which has a bunch of different brightness values, but the part that our eye is drawn to has a value really in the mid 80s, around 85%. And so we'll create another point here and we'll move this up to 85% like that. And finally, there's just a few random visual elements, and these things are really just kind of decoration. They're not very important, but let's look at their values. We've got one down here that's a 6% brightness, and then the rest of these seem to be around 12. The little dots in them are a little bit brighter, but they're around 12%. So we've got an unimportant thing, that design element, at around 6% brightness, and let me duplicate that and add another one at around 12%. And so currently, our value structure looks something like this. Now you can probably already predict what the problem is. The problem is, as I mentioned, our eye is drawn to contrast. So where are the areas of highest contrast? Well, the areas of highest contrast are between the ISS and all of this unimportant stuff. The background, which takes up most of the frame, is kind of in the middle, but there's more contrast between that and the ISS than there is between that and the type. And remember, the type is generally the most important thing on the screen, and so it should have the most contrast. That's probably the easiest way to get people to look at it. Right now, it has the least amount of contrast. Between the background and the type, there's only a 3% difference, but between the ISS and the background, there's more than a 50% difference. And this is why when you look at this design, your eye immediately goes here and it barely even registers the type. So how would we fix this? The easiest way would be to fix the value structure. And we can do that simply by creating more of a distance, more contrast between the things that are important and less contrast for things that are less important. So the ISS, as cool as it is not as important as the type. And so the type could even be pushed up higher. You know, it could be 100%, it could be in the 90s, but even just doing this, it's going to have so much more contrast between itself and the background. For that matter, the background doesn't need to be 1/3 of the way up the chart. It could be down here, it could be lower. And now these unimportant things that we really don't care about, we want the viewer to see those things because they kind of add some visual interest to the design, but we don't want them to notice them first. We want them to notice those things last. And by having only a tiny amount of contrast and value between the background and those things, they'll tend to fall back and blend into the background, which is what we want. So we've got our background, we've got the most amount of contrast with the type, which is the important thing, and then less contrast with the ISS, and then even less contrast with these unimportant things. So what does it look like if we actually apply this value structure to the design? Let's start by working with this background image, which is this layer right here. And I actually like the blue color of it, so I don't want to do anything too drastic to the color. I just want to darken the pixels. I only really want to mess with the brightness value. The easiest way to do that is going to be to go to Effect, Color Correction, Levels. And then I'm going to grab this arrow here, the black input, which basically is going to tell After Effects, make every pixel darker than this arrow black. Right now it's set to black, but if I move it over, it's going to start darkening everything. Now remember, we're aiming at around a 6% value for that background. So let's start moving this and see what happens. If I put this down, I don't know, somewhere in there, and then I hover my mouse over it, you'll see that the brightness values are now in the 30s and 40s, which I think we could still go a little bit lower, but that's a far cry from where we started. So let's move this thing somewhere down towards the middle. Cool, and now checking it, I can see that we're in the low to mid 20s. Now, this isn't the 6% that we had on the chart, but I have a feeling that that might be too dark and we'd lose a lot of the color. So let's leave it here and see how it works. Now, there is an issue I'm already starting to see, and maybe you are too. Remember, our eyes are drawn to areas of contrast. And so what do we have around the edges of this image? We have these really bright pixels. These might be snow caps or water. Whatever it is, it's drawing my eye to it. And so I'd like to darken these pixels, but not really darken these anymore. How could I do that? I could try to do it just using the levels effect. This white output slider here is going to affect the maximum brightness, the maximum value of the pixels on this layer. And so if I move this, say, down to 50% around here, you can see that now those have gotten a heck of a lot dimmer, but the problem is it's darkened everything else too. So I could back the black input off a little bit, check my values here and see, okay, we're still around that 20% mark. And this has had the effect of really flattening out the image. There's not much contrast in it anymore. And here's the thing, as an editor, especially if you color correct footage, your instincts are generally to pull as much contrast as possible out of images. But when you're designing, a lot of times you actually want to do the opposite. You want to flatten elements so that you can really carefully manipulate the value structure of the overall design. And so even though on its own, this isn't going to be very appealing to look at, this is actually a pretty good starting point. Let me unsolo this layer, and you'll see already the design is starting to work much, much, much better. Now remember, the most important element here is the type, and that needs to have a really high brightness value so that we'll get the maximum contrast between it and the background. Here is that type layer, and you can see it's got a fill effect on it. So this is really cool. If I click on this color, you can see here, this B, this brightness value is 50. I don't want to mess with the hue. I don't want to mess with the saturation. I only care about the value. And so if I set this color picker to only adjust the brightness, I can then just move this number up. And I can push it up as high as I want to. And you can see the further away from the background it gets, the more contrast you see. And so at 100%, you have this really, really bright area in the design now. Your eye goes right to it. But sometimes I do like to be a little subtle, so why don't we leave that around 91%? It's already working better, but now I want to make sure that your eye doesn't go to the ISS too soon. There's this concept in design called hierarchy. And the basic idea is I want to control what my viewer looks at first, second, third. So now I've pretty much ensured that the first thing they're going to look at is the type, but this is still kind of competing with it. So what can we do about that? Well, first we can select the layer and we can add that same levels effect to it. And remember, the brightness values in the brightest part of this are actually in the 90s. So let's grab the white output slider and bring that down to kind of cap those white levels. So this does accomplish the goal. It makes this way less noticeable at first. So your eye goes here and then kind of drifts down here. But it's also kind of made that element a little bit bland looking. And this is where After Effects is really powerful because you have total control over what areas of your image are getting these effects. So here's a cool trick. I'm going to duplicate this levels effect and I'm going to reset it. And then I'm going to pull this white input up a little bit to bring contrast back. Now, this may not make sense, but it will in a minute. I'm going to rename this copy of levels Brighten. Then I'm going to make sure that the ISS layer is selected. I'm going to come up here to my ellipse tool and I'm going to draw an elliptical mask on this part of that layer. Then I'm going to push E to reveal the effects on that layer. And I'm concerned with this Brighten one. If you twirl open the arrow here next to the effect, you'll see some options. And the one I want down here is compositing options. If I click this plus, it adds a mask reference. A mask reference is a really cool feature that lets you draw a mask and control where an effect shows up based on that mask. Now you can see as soon as I did that, the mask quit cutting the layer out. And instead what it's doing now is it's cutting out that effect. Let me turn off the mask boundaries and you'll be able to see this even better. And let's zoom in. So you can clearly see I have a brighter area inside of this layer now, and I can control that with this levels effect. But the boundary is really hard, it's very obvious. So if I hit F to bring up the mask feather property, I can then increase that feather and soften the edge of that effect. And then if I turn mask visibility back on, I can even come in here and very precisely control where I want that effect to happen. So I can control exactly what part of the ISS should be brighter and which part should be darker. And I'm pretty happy with that because if you notice, most of the ISS now, it's around the same value as the background. It's pretty close to it, and so you don't really look at it. But that part in the middle is brighter and it draws your eye. But I was very careful only to use this part of it so that this part draws your eye, not as much as the type though. And so the value structure that I've set up is probably something like this. The type is really bright, the background is pretty dark, and the ISS is mostly close to the background, but a little bit bright in some areas. And now you can see how I've controlled the viewer's eye by focusing only on value. Remember, we haven't moved anything. We haven't changed any layers other than the colors. Now, what about all of these other layers? Well, the truth is a lot of these layers really are not important. For example, this dots layer, if I turn it on and off, you can see it's just this subtle kind of texture in the background. And so sometimes the easiest thing to do with little details like this is just turn the opacity down. So if I hit T to bring up the opacity property, I can just bring that down. And I'm going to zoom in here so I can see this at full res. And here's a trick I like to do sometimes. I'll bring the opacity all the way down and then I'll slowly bring it up until it's just starting to annoy me. And then I'll bring it down a little bit. Using this trick, a lot of times you'll find that little details you're obsessing over when you're designing something actually aren't that important. And in this case, those dots are very much not important. Now, you can still feel them more than you see them, which is actually, I think, really good. Now, you've got this element here, which has a lot of contrast and is kind of distracting my eye from this type. And that's this map square layer right here. So why don't we add a levels effect to it? bring the white value down a little bit. Now, I don't want it to be like blending in with the background. I want it a little bit bright, somewhere in there. I think that feels pretty good. But this bright topographical overlay on top of it is a little bit distracting. So I can just hop into that pre-comp, and you can see we have this broken out onto layers. And so I could just do that same opacity effect and just turn the opacity down, maybe somewhere in there. And now that's definitely less distracting, but I do kind of miss some of that contrast. So now I can kind of dial this in. I can bring the white output back a little bit. And I can do another trick too. You can lock a comp viewer in After Effects by clicking this lock icon. Then if you go into a pre-comp by double clicking it, it will open that pre-comp in another composition window, but you can go back to the original one while still seeing the layers for the pre-comp you're in. So this means I can adjust the opacity of the map layer while seeing the result. And so I can hold shift and use the up arrow to just nudge this thing until it looks good. This is actually a really useful trick. I use it all the time to be able to work in one pre-comp but see the result in another. And it's really, really easy. You should try it. And now I'm focusing on this square that's behind the type. And this is really important because it's literally touching the type. I want to make sure it's not competing for attention. So I can pull this white output down. That will certainly do the trick. I can also try adjusting this gamma arrow here because sometimes you'll get a little bit more saturation out of the colors when you do that. And so it'll still look really pretty, but it won't mute the colors as much as just pulling that white output down. And I usually use a combo of both, so I am going to pull it down a little bit. But let me just show you a before and after here. If I turn this levels effect off and on, look how much cleaner the type looks, how much easier it is to read, and how much easier it is to immediately know where I want you to look. So this is where we ended up. You can see how quick of a read it is now. Your eye immediately goes to the type, then it goes to the ISS, and all of the rest of this stuff is just kind of there to support the design, help balance the composition, and add to this feeling that this is like a techie thing we're looking at. And if you look at where we started from, it's really, really clear how powerful just understanding this concept of value structure is. By only focusing on the brightness values of the colors in this design, we were able to drastically affect the legibility and the effectiveness of it. And so if you just keep this idea in mind, the next time you're designing anything, you'll find that it's a lot easier to get the result you want. Now I'm going to show you another example that will probably help you on every single edit that you ever touch. But first I'd like to say this, if you're an editor and you're not comfortable in After Effects or designing or animating and you'd like to be, I have some good news for you. The one and only Jake Bartlett has created an amazing class for School of Motion called After Effects for Editors. In this class, you'll not only learn how to use After Effects and feel really comfortable in it, but you'll also learn some basic design and animation principles. You'll learn how to do lots of things that editors are constantly asked to do: cleanup, tracking, drawing masks around things, applying effects. Jake, as you probably know, is an incredible teacher, and so I recommend that you check out the link in the description to find out more information about After Effects for Editors. All right, so here's one more example, and this is something that is probably a lot more common for editors. You've got a beautiful shot and you got to put white type over it, and it doesn't quite read as nicely as you'd like. And I bet you've been in this situation before and you've probably tried adding a drop shadow or a stroke around the type or something like that. But now that you know about value structure, you might be able to think of a better way. Now let's start by checking the brightness values here. So the type is white, so that's going to be 100% brightness. And a lot of these pixels around it are in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but some of these lens flare pixels, some of these God ray pixels are in the high 90s, very close to 100%. And so while this does read, we can make it a lot cleaner. So the easiest thing to do would be to grab the background layer and color correct it a little bit. We're going to use that same levels effect. And simply by bringing that white output down, you're going to see very quickly what a difference that makes. Here's a before and after. And even just that little adjustment makes the type so much more readable. But there's a problem, Joey, you say. And I know there is. I kind of ruined the image. It looks like crap now. And this is the reason that I like to do stuff like this in After Effects versus Premiere, because you have a little bit more control over it. I'm going to turn this levels effect off for a minute, and I'm going to go up to layer, and I'm going to add a new adjustment layer. I'm going to make sure the adjustment layer is in between my title layer and my background, and let's rename this Darken. And now I'm going to cut that levels effect off of the background and paste it onto Darken and turn it back on. Okay, so now we have that same effect. Now when that adjustment layer is over the whole image, it looks awful. So let's fix that. I'm going to grab my pen tool, which you can use to draw masks on layers like adjustment layers, and I'm just going to very quickly trace the outline of this. And this is one of the things I love about After Effects is you can do stuff like this really, really quickly. I can adjust this to make it a little nicer looking. And then let me turn off my mask visibility for a minute so you can see this really clearly. And you know where I'm going with this. I'm going to feather the mask, and this is going to leave the rest of the image untouched. So I'll hit F to bring up my feather property, and I will just increase that feather. Now here's the crazy thing about this. If I didn't tell you that there was an adjustment layer back there darkening the footage, you wouldn't know. And that's the point of this trick. So if we zoom in here, and I want you to look up here at the brightness values, right? The type is still 100, but now these pixels behind it, right behind the type, these lens flare pixels are in the 70s. And remember, they were in the high 90s. They were almost 100% before. I'm gonna turn this adjustment layer off and turn it back on. And when I do that, it's obvious that the adjustment layer is there, but if I don't tell you, you don't see it. But simply by focusing on the value of the colors in the immediate area of the type, I've made this type so much more readable. So try that. The next time you have to put white type on a piece of footage or an image, which, let's be honest, is probably gonna be today or tomorrow, use this trick. And you can do this in Premiere, by the way. It's just easier, I think, and more powerful in After Effects. You have more options, you have more control. And again, if you're interested in becoming better at After Effects and learning design principles and animation principles to help your work get better, check out our courses at schoolofmotion.com, including After Effects for Editors, which is made for editors just like you. And that is it for this video. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can see tips 2 and 3 when they drop, and I'll see you next time.